Okay, so as it's 8:30 now, I think we'll get started. So yeah, good morning, everybody. This is part 4 of the CIWEM Chartership Competencies Breakfast webinar series. It's running for 12 weeks. So this is week number 4. So as an introduction, I presented a few weeks ago, but my name's Katherine Woollard, work for Thames Water as a water resources management plan specialist. I think as this series has now been running for a few sessions, there's no need to kind of go through the full introduction that we have done for the previous sessions, just to say that those presentations are available on the CIWEM website if you would like to listen back. So the format of this session, as has been for the previous weeks, is to introduce the competency, set out the key questions, give some example responses, set some activities for today, set some activities for this week, and then cross-reference to other accreditations, because the focus here is on Chartered Water and Environment Manager. And there are other accreditations which link in Chartered Environmentalist, Chartered Scientist, and Chartered Engineer, and we'll just cross-reference to those rather than focusing on them through these sessions. So this is the schedule, which you'll be familiar with now. Ian presented last week on the first of the B competencies. So the B competencies are planning, implementation, and evaluation of work. So Ian last week presented on B1, which is the ability to analyse and evaluate environmental and/or water problems. This week, I will be presenting on the ability to solve problems by identifying, developing and evaluating options. So looking at evaluating problems last week and then moving forward to think about options to solve those problems. And then next week, Jack will be presenting on B3, which is the ability to initiate, implement and manage change. So as always, kind of got the exam question, which you're looking to answer in your response. So the first point here is you should demonstrate the use of advanced scientific, engineering, management, environmental principles as appropriate when formulating potential solutions to a problem. You will need to demonstrate that you have considered the implications of each method of working or solution, identifying the solution that fits best with the issues and requirements identified. For example, regulatory, legislative, social, economic, environmental, and customer. And you will use evidence to support the recommended solution and be able to show how the decision was made. So again, feels quite daunting when you read it in those terms, but when you start to break it down into the key questions, it becomes a bit more manageable and you can take it in bite-sized chunks. So the first of the questions, so what was the problem and what was your role at the time? So what was the problem you were trying to address and what was the role you were in where you were trying to address that problem? What solutions did you identify and consider? What were your priorities? What was the purpose and the result of this prioritization? What evaluation did you undertake? What were the evaluation criteria? Which solution did you recommend and why? How did you use creative and original thought in identifying potential solutions? How did you compare widely differing options to find a best solution? And how do you illustrate your method of presenting your analysis and options to a client? So to kind of start thinking through those key questions, we're going to think about some examples. When I think of this competency, again, breaking it down, there are kind of 3 main areas that you need to be covering off. So the first is what is the problem? The second is the evaluation or the appraisal of the different options that you're thinking about to solve that problem. And then finally, what's the solution that you come to? So the first of the examples is centered on catchment flood management plans. So here the issue is that the catchment and flood issues need managing. So there's a catchment flood management plan structure in place which supports evaluating the different options to form the basis of that management plan. So here as assistant project manager, I considered various management options, taking into account specific features of the area and the opinions of the local environment agency staff to develop a policy for each area of the catchment. So the evaluation piece, I evaluated each policy according to technical, social, environmental and economic criteria, and that resulted in coming up with that catchment and flood management policy as the solution. So as a second example here, I was commissioned to determine the frequency of overtopping defences embankments on a river between two locations. So that's the problem, is what is the frequency of the overtopping defences? Needing to take into account combined effects of fluvial flows and tidal levels, so another layer to the problem. And then what was the evaluation of the options? So here, undertaking a large sample of fluvial tidal event combinations, running different model events, entering results into probability analysis spreadsheets, and then comparing options is all part of that evaluation process. The structure is the modelling, the structure is the spreadsheets and the graphs that were used. And then the solutions, being able to identify the key options, were used in assisting with defence management and cost benefit analysis for new defence schemes. So a third example here, this time we're looking at how a water supply works was identified at risk of high nitrate concentrations by the Drinking Water Inspectorate. So catchment management options had already been implemented by the Environment Agency, but the problem was that there were rising concentrations of nitrates and forecast water quality failures. Removing that from the water supply works from service and an alternative supply being identified led to deterioration in water pressure as an additional problem. And then also the condition and the remaining service of life of the reservoir was also a concern. So that's outlining what the problem was. Evaluating the solutions. So here there are different options to address that solution that were evaluated. So here the examples are, there was 6 kilometres of mains reinforcement or removing the tower. However, cost came into that evaluation piece, higher than the scheme budget to reinforce that amount of main. Determining that the water tower needed to be retained to maintain pressure and provide resilience. So there, the feasibility of whether that tower could be removed or not was identified. Again, cost around renovating the tower was considered. And then the solutions were decided on once that evaluation of options had been thought through thoroughly. So the final solution was 0.8 kilometres of mains reinforcement, retaining the tower, and then tankering during peak year demands, as the best solution still had a problem in that during peak demands, there was a deficit in the tower level that needed to be mitigated against. So this is a really good example of a real good in-depth description of the problem, looking at various options, and even talking about an alternate option of installing a booster and alternative sources of supply, and the fact that they were disregarded because the asset requirements were costly, and the carbon and environmental impact. If you can pull in around carbon, environment as well as cost, you're getting that kind of best value solution. So that's a really good aspect to this example as well. And then finally, the solution that was come to and decided upon at the end. So this one's a bit of a shorter example, just to say as well, so these are kind of giving you a flavour of the types of responses and that you should be producing. The length, as we've talked about before, depends on the competency that you're addressing. Trying to get as much of kind of the water environment into it as possible is really good, but it's up to your own kind of personal experience as to how much or little you do include. So here the example is, as part of the Northern Line extension tunnelling work, contingency plans are required should the nearby major trunk mains be affected in any way and be required to be shut in. So here the solution is kind of put up front. So I delivered contingency plans for the shut and how supply could be maintained to customers. And then the evaluation bit is done at the end here. So this was done by developing and simulating infusions, cross connections, alternative sources, or calculating the length and size of the rider mains while maintaining pressures and water quality for the surrounding customers. This gave confidence that if mains were affected by the tunnelling, that a robust contingency was in place. So that one's quite a nice, in a nutshell, problem evaluation and solution. And then a final example here. So this is all around evaluating a new water supply option for a water company. So there was a need to amend and extend a historic agreement between a water company and a power station. The water supply aspect was that the water company was buying a portion of the power station's underutilised abstraction licence due to changing cooling requirements. So the problem is needing to amend and extend this existing agreement that's been in place, legacy agreement, and the options for amending and extending it. What would that new agreement look like? So evaluating that, this pulls in kind of information collecting to help with that evaluation of options. So supporting senior managers with negotiations to kind of glean that information, bringing insight to the feasibility of the different options. From an operational perspective, understanding feasibility, but then also using that modelling structure and framework to understand the actual water resources benefit running scenarios as part of that options evaluation over a range of timescales, and then feeding that into cost benefit analysis to determine which the best option is. So as a solution, presenting the results, recommending that as monitoring data was limited, the particular option to take forward, so here a flat consumptive use profile, more feasible than varying the profile through the year or 3 years based on state of drought. And also bringing cost into it, as it was the lowest cost option, and also as there was no change in the operation of the power station required. And then taking that forward another step, saying that this person did this piece of work, and then that fed into a bigger framework of the water resources management plan for the company. And that's a new supply option feeding into that decision-making options appraisal process. So another layer of kind of option evaluation, and the fact that then that option was then selected as part of the company's preferred programme of solutions to help solve the supply-demand deficit for the company. So I think this example is quite useful because it's what the individual did to support that particular option, which then fed into a larger, kind of bigger picture framework and structure of the water resources management plan that possibly they weren't directly involved in, but they show that understanding of the wider company's structures for evaluating options to solve problems, supply demand deficits, and finding solutions to that. So that's a nice layered example with the bigger picture included. Okay, so been through the examples now. So the activity for today, so discuss on the forum, and we will get this forum up and running. I know we keep mentioning it each week, so as soon as we have details of that, we will let you know, or discuss with your peers at work. So types of research or investigation that you've carried out to address problems, methods of identifying, developing and evaluating options you have used, what successful outcomes you have had and solutions you have identified, and what lessons have you learnt from being unsuccessful in finding solutions to problems? So that last one is kind of turning it on its head. Have you, worked to find a solution to a problem, been unsuccessful, but learnt a lesson and taken that forward into another project that's equally as valid as looking at it from the other perspective? And then the activity for this week is making a list of 5 problems or projects that you have worked on in your career. Consider how your ability to solve these problems through the identifying, developing and evaluating options has changed in this time. So spend 15 minutes answering the key questions for this week as well. So moving on to tips, we've been through these before, but just to keep them in the forefront of your mind, always write in the first person. So I'm only interested in what you have done, not what your team have done. Be honest about what you've contributed to a project, understand why you're doing a particular task, what's that bigger picture, so that last example is a good example of that. Be concise, so some of the more in the nutshell examples versus some of the more wordy examples. I think previously we've mentioned kind of 2 examples per competency, so you could have a more meaty one and a more concise in a nutshell one. And then remember what you've written, so that when you come to your professional review interview, you can recall what you've said. And don't limit yourself to experience as a current employer or paid employment. Think back to previous experience. All of the experience that you have is valid, particularly that in the water and environment field. So cross-referencing to other accreditations. So while you're looking at B2, you might want to also consider incorporating the following professional, working towards these other charterships, so environmentalist, engineer, or scientist. So just working through these. So if you are looking towards scientist as well as chartered water environment manager, there's A2, use theoretical and practical methods in the analysis and solution of problems. B1, plan and organise projects effectively. And B2, work effectively in a team. If you're looking towards environmentalist, analyse and evaluate problems from an environmental perspective to develop practical sustainable solutions and anticipate environmental trends to develop practical solutions. And B1, influence others to promote behavioural and cultural change to secure environmental improvement beyond legislative compliance. And B2, promote a strategic environmental approach, analyse and evaluate problems from an environmental perspective, develop practical sustainable solutions, and anticipate environmental trends to develop practical solutions. Looking through those, there isn't one there for engineer. I'm not sure whether that's because there isn't a directly applicable competency for that, but I can look into that and report back in a future session. Okay, so that was the B2 competency. Next week we'll be moving on to B3. So it says what knowledge of wider issues and trends. That's not correct, actually, apologies for that. So B3 is ability to initiate, implement and manage change. So that will be next week's session. Okay, great. So I think what I'll do is I'll just go back. So we've had this a couple of times, people asking during the Q&A, just to keep on the activity page so that you can kind of be thinking through those as we're discussing the questions. So I'm just having a look at the Q&A now. So one of the first questions is so it's asking if you need to keep things anonymous, basically, as you're writing your responses to the competencies, for example, names of clients, sites, locations. No, that's not needed, and it's actually good to refer to the particular company you worked for or the particular location. We've only done that in these slides because it's going out to a wide audience and some of them are our own personal examples, so we're just keeping it anonymous in that respect. But when you're actually writing your application, absolutely put details in, clients, sites, locations, because as well, when it comes to a professional review interview, the interviewers will be interested to talk in detail about those projects, and they'll be from similar industry and they'll be interested in the specifics of your response. So yeah, details are good to put in there. The second question is, how far back would you say it is reasonable to look at for examples? So, I mean, for me, all prior experience is valid because that's built up to the career professional that you are today. So from the beginning of your career is fine. One thing that should really come through in your application is that water and environment train of experience. So it may be, there might be transferable skills and some examples, health and safety, those types of competencies where you can pull on other types of careers that you may have had. But the more water environment centric you can make it, the better, really. So I think maybe if you've entered the water industry, for example, at one particular point in time and had experience, you could draw from that particular water industry experience with a few smaller examples from a previous career, say. But yeah, definitely kind of keeping it water environment focused and going as far back as you can if it's relevant, absolutely fine. Okay, so another question here. If you have two similar examples in terms of the project and your role in the project, is it still best to include them both? Yes, no, absolutely. So I think like I was saying before, I think the interviewers are very interested. I mean, I think kind of, yeah, setting the scene. So the project is what you were working on, how you were trying to solve that problem. The project is the means really to get to your solution. And then what you did, your role in the first person, I did this, this was my role, this was the way I evaluated the options, this was my recommendation, my solution that I found that was taken forward. That definitely getting both aspects into your response is a good way to go. Can you use examples from your PhD research? Yes, absolutely. I think that comes back to, I mean, PhD, fantastic, you know, the project that you've worked on, contributed to academia, so absolutely draw on it. I think one thing to say on that is not referring to it throughout. What you want to be showing is your breadth of experience since your PhD as well. So it can feed in, it can support, it can be one main example in for one of the competencies, but I think keeping that breadth and that diversity across the competencies is probably key there. But no, absolutely, it's a really good thing to include. And I think that is all the questions. So if anybody else has any further questions for today, otherwise, I think we'll leave it there. Okay, so thanks very much everyone for joining.
Thanks, Katie. Just to remind everyone to, if they could register for each week separately using the links on the webpage, and to remind everyone that booking closes 24 hours before the webinar. So look forward to seeing you all next Wednesday, but don't forget to book 24 hours in advance at least to make sure you get the link. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Jack. All right. Thanks, everyone. And yeah, don't forget to sign up to Jack next week, B3, ability to initiate, implement and manage change.